Good evening everybody. Welcome to Gayfield Creative Spaces and to the 18th Café des Artistes event, which is also the last. These events run under the auspices of the Artist Rooms Research Partnership, a 5-year mission, as they used to say on Star Trek, a partnership between National Galleries of Scotland, Tate and University of Edinburgh, working also with University of Newcastle and Glasgow. And our mission was to do high quality research and public engagement, knowledge exchange, dialogue around the Artist Rooms collection, which many of you will know is a major collection of mostly work by living artists. So there are some artists from earlier periods in the collection. There are now 40 artists, I think, am I right in saying, in the collection. Somebody's nodding at me, who knows, good. There are, I think, 1,600 works or thereabouts. Also nodding, filling me with confidence. So, as I say, this is going to be the last Café event. That's not to say that in the future we won't be able to run some other kinds of events like this, because I know that a number of the people here I recognise who've been to lots of these events and enjoy this kind of space of dialogue about all kinds of interesting works by living artists. So, the format of the evening is that we have 2 speeches by experts in the field of German 20th century art and Richter. And then we're going to have a period of time when you will be set the usual homework for discussion. Now you're sitting in serried ranks here, right? So it's like it's a lecture, yeah? But we will make you get up and have a glass of wine and talk about these problems that we're going to set you around Richter. And then we'll come back together at the end for some argument about Richter. So, this evening's focus of study, Gerhard Richter, is, well, I think probably one of the most important artists of the last 30 years. And he's certainly been the subject of a lot of quite sophisticated interpretation. And our 2 speakers this evening are going to navigate us through this material. First up is my colleague Christian Weikop, who is a senior lecturer in history of art and has published an awful lot on people like Georg Baselitz and Anselm Kiefer.
But not Richter.
But not Richter. And actually he was guilty of recently saying that Anselm Kiefer was the greatest artist of the 20th century or something or other. And I said to him, I bet Gerhard Richter has something to say about that.
Indeed.
Christian probably needs no introduction, and I know some of his fan club are here in the back rows. But he has, as I say, published a great deal, and most recently he published what's called an In Focus project. That's an online major publication on Kiefer's Occupations series, which is an incredible series of performances photographed of Kiefer doing Nazi salutes in various locations. And you can find that online on the Tate and National Galleries of Scotland websites. Well, eventually National Galleries of Scotland websites, we hope, but certainly on the Tate website. And our second speaker is Aline Guillermet, who I first came across as an applicant for a PhD place at the University of Essex, from Lyon, to work on Richter. It was an application to work on Richter, I think. Yeah. And she did a fantastic PhD project on Richter, which she finished, what's that, a year ago. And she's got an article coming out in Art History soon, in the journal Art History, on Richter. Yes. So Christian's quite worried because Aline knows an awful lot about Richter. Okay. So what's going on here is there's been a bit of we're good now, yeah? We're good. Some technological hoo-has. So I'm going to hand over now to Christian. He's going to introduce Richter to us, and then we'll go straight on to Aline, then we'll have a break.
Okay, thanks. I think I'll try and do without it.
Okay, tell us, if you can't hear it well enough, let us know.
Toshi, can you hear me at the back?
Yeah.
Good, alright. As Neil has indicated, I'll be taking sort of a wide angle on Richter today and putting him in context of a sort of post-45 German art scene and looking at him in particular in relation to Kiefer and Baselitz. And Aline will be taking a tighter focus, I would imagine, on Richter's work. So I'll try and provide a context for you. So we have these three important artists for the post-45 period. 3 of 5 German artists in the Artist Rooms collection. Gerhard Richter, born in 1932 in Dresden, in Saxony. Georg Baselitz, also born in Saxony, a little bit later on in 1938. And then Anselm Kiefer, who was born in the Black Forest region, Donaueschingen, Baden-Württemberg, in 1945, 2 months before the end of the Second World War. And I should say that both Richter and Baselitz had their art training in East Germany, and Kiefer had his art training in Freiburg and Karlsruhe, and was also mentored by Joseph Beuys in Düsseldorf for a while. So, I don't know if you can see that, we haven't got much in the way of blackout today, Neil, but anyway, we should be okay. So, as I say, Richter trained in East Germany, trained at the Dresden Art Academy in 1951, and he worked in the mural department, as well as producing propaganda for the socialist regime. 5 years after Richter, Baselitz applied for the Dresden Academy too, but was rejected. Baselitz then got into Hochschule für Bildende Künste in East Berlin in 1956, but was expelled for socio-political immaturity. Interestingly enough. In 1957, he enrolled at the Hochschule der Künste in West Berlin. And Richter fled East Germany in 1961, so both he and Baselitz were in effect what the Germans call Grenzgänger, border crossers. And you can see one of Richter's early works, just about, because there's so much sunlight coming through today. You can see one of Richter's early works for the GDR here, in this mural for the Hygiene Museum. By contrast to the socialist realist art doctrine that Richter had to put up with in the East, in the West, artists were strongly encouraged to pursue a line of the international language rather of abstraction. This is an example here from the Zen 49, a particular group coming out of West Germany at this time. But both Richter and Baselitz were excited by the influx of New York School abstract expressionism, when these works were first shown in West Germany in the late 1950s. Richter went to Documenta 2, and Baselitz went to both Documenta 2 and the MoMA touring show, New American Painting, where he was subjected to the work of Jackson Pollock and de Kooning for the first time. Both were impressed by the scale and ambition of Pollock, and Baselitz was particularly drawn to the sort of compelling, grotesque aesthetic of de Kooning. So in 1963, Baselitz exhibited a rather explicit work, Big Night Down the Drain, at a new gallery in Berlin established by Michael Werner, which resulted in the confiscation of the work and a fine for both the artist and dealer. The distorted figure was intended to represent Hitler, something made clearer in the remix versions. And Baselitz's work appeared to allude to and ironise the Nazi obsession with perfect Aryan bodies, evident in the fascist mode of heroic realism, and conversely their conception of the degenerate bodies of expressionism. The artist was not making a scandal for its own sake, but rather he was confronting post-war Germany, which he found too ready to hide behind what he saw as bland abstraction. The agonising distortions and contortions of the human figure is a link between Baselitz and his expressionist forebears, although it should be noted that the fundamental anti-harmony of Baselitz's painting also owes much to his appreciation of mannerism. You can see here, putting Baselitz next to Schiele and Kokoschka, how he kind of relates to that expressionist tradition. Meanwhile, though, as Werner was having his Baselitz exhibition closed down in Berlin, Gerhard Richter was doing something rather different in Düsseldorf. So, Richter fled, as I say, he fled East Germany in the early 1960s, and he went to West Germany and he studied at the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf. And there he studied with painters who were promoting really a European gestural abstraction called art informel. But he was less interested in this subjectivity and more interested in learning about this new world of commercial advertising and mass production. And this is what capitalist realism responds to. So with Polka, Sigmar Polka that is, and Konrad Lug, he introduced the term capitalist realism. The title referred to the realist style of art known as socialist realism, which Richter had practiced in the GDR, but it also commented upon the consumer-driven art doctrine of Western capitalism. Now, their emigre experience gave them a comparative view of two separate and different cultures, defined by competing ideologies. One, Germany was economically oppressed communist state, the other a capitalist showcase. The now legendary happening Living with Pop, you see an installation photograph here, a demonstration for capitalist realism, was staged in a furniture store in Düsseldorf, coming out of a kind of Fluxus tradition too. And two famous paintings by Richter from his early years, Neuschwanstein Castle and Stag, were shown in this, this furniture store, and they were for sale. And Richter sort of acted as a salesman in this kind of happening, guiding customers around the store and encouraging them to purchase these works. So, and this is another example of a capitalist realist exhibition a little bit later on in Hanover at the Galerie Haar.
Christian, can you step back? Can you go back a bit, because I'm sure everyone can see the screen.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Yeah. I'm never quite sure where to stand in this. Right. Baselitz criticised Richter for sort of selling out, in his opinion, selling out to an American idea of art, kind of American pop art. And he said that Richter had lost sight of German tradition. But actually, Richter, if you think about his castle, his stag, however ironically treated, and in fact, Love is in the Forest here, these are motifs that still remain within a German tradition, in fact. There are many renditions of Love is in the Forest in Expressionist art, for example, but also earlier on. So, a pop sensibility perhaps, but still a kind of German motif, something that was prevalent in the German tradition. Now, whilst Richter was part of this cool Düsseldorf neo-avant-garde, if you like, Baselitz was producing these extraordinary fracture paintings in Swabia in the mid to late 60s. And these are so-called fracture paintings, and they look as if the canvas has been cut up and reassembled in a manner of a jigsaw, but with pieces missing. And this technique of disjuncture and displacement is important because it implies aesthetic and ideological discontinuity. His 1967 painting, Mice and Foresters, harks back to his own days in East Germany, but they provide the best example of this fracture method. The choice of motif is appropriate because woodsmen were sanctioned by the Third Reich, as was the work of woodcutting and building log roads. The dismemberment, then, of a familiar subject in Baselitz's paintings thereby alludes to the dismemberment of an entire nation by the Nazis and the subsequent division of Germany after the war. And so, as I say, while Baselitz was living with his family pretty much cut off in rural Swabia, Richter was collaborating closely with the likes of Lug, Palermo and Polka, and he was part of this cool urban neo-avant-garde who exhibited in the cities of the Ruhr, and in 1970 this lot even came to the Edinburgh College of Art, interestingly, part of DeMarco's big exhibition there, ECA. And they were all responding in their own way to pop art and other international currents. In 1970 in Munich, Gerhard Richter met Brigitte Berlin, alias Brigitte Polk, Andy Warhol's legendary muse and enfant terrible from New York's high society. This meeting gave rise to an important Brigitte Polk series by Richter based on Polaroid self-portraits, and established a kind of dialogue, in a sense, between America and Europe, photography, painting, artist and muse. But if we return to the Galerie Haar artist book for a moment, we can see that Richter may well have been thinking beyond American pop. This photograph of Polk and Richter has always reminded me of the English performance duo Gilbert and George. And this connection is not entirely coincidental. Gosh, it's really hard to see these images, isn't it? It's very, very difficult. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's just because the sunlight's... when you have these pop-up venues, you've got to cope with these kind of problems, right? Well, anyway, this is Gerhard Richter's portraits of Gilbert and George. It is good quality, you just can't see it. So as we know, Gilbert and George presented as living sculptures, wearing similar tweed suits, doing everything together. And Richter made portraits of him, 7 or 8 paintings in all, in fact. And Richter and Polka's collaboration was also very intense for a while. And in this photograph, also taken from the Gallery Ha artist book, we see Polka and Richter families seated at the table, taking up the upper half of the photograph. There are 3 paintings. Polka's Sausages, Uncle Rudy, which you can just about see, there from 1965. And as Olivia Tate has observed, while the setting domesticates the buildings by embedding them in a familial context, the paintings in turn serve to remove the scene from the conventional settings found in a petit bourgeois family album. You can just see that's Uncle Rudy painted, as I say, there above these artists. They're kind of staging this bourgeois family life. The performances and installations of Joseph Beuys, the most influential German artist, would have provided an important model for both Richter and Kiefer, especially his performance at the Festival of New Art in Aachen in 1964, when after being punched on the nose by a student of civil engineering, Beuys seized a crucifix in his left hand, raised his right arm in a gesture that could be interpreted as a Zikal salute, something only accentuated by the blood dripping down his upper lip, like some grotesque imitation of Hitler's moustache. Beuys, in many ways, had a definition of the performative as homeopathic or even exorcistic, and these notions have some point of contact with Kiefer's work too. But it's been pointed out, unlike Beuys, who often performed for live audiences in the mass media, Kiefer acted primarily for the camera. Because Kiefer occupied the role of the saluting Nazi himself in these photographs, his work had greater potential to provoke than Gerhard Richter's earlier blurred photo painting, Uncle Rudy, which depicted the artist's maternal uncle smiling and posing in his new Wehrmacht uniform not long before he was killed in action. And Kiefer reiterated the representation of the Zikal gesture from his occupation's performance in works in various media between 1969 and 1970, manifesting a curious compulsion to repeat. Occupations was not seen in the public sphere until 1975, when some of those photographs that had been taken in '69, both in Kiefer's Karlsruhe studio and on location across Europe, were carefully selected and sequenced by the artist and published as a photo essay, Occupations, in issue 12 of the Cologne-based art journal Interfunktionen, then edited by Benjamin Buchloh. The conceptual artist Marcel Breuters did not see any parodic humour or deconstructive tendency in Kiefer's work, and he would express outrage at the publication. He angrily stated, "Who is this fascist who thinks he's an anti-fascist?" His reaction effectively cut off funding for the next issue and sealed the fate of what had until then been the most important European art magazine since World War II. And so this is the first of a sequence of 18 photographs in Occupations. There's a memorable photograph which shows Kiefer saluting, framed by the pollarded branches of a plane tree, to be found on the lower promenade of the Place Royale du Pérou in Montpellier. Now, the arboreal, with all its connotations of German cultural identity, was extremely important for both Baselitz and Kiefer. Kiefer greatly admired Baselitz's work of the mid to late 1960s. A key work of this period is Tree of 1966, which depicts a bare anthropomorphic specimen with severed bleeding branches. It is suggestive of atrocity in the forest and undermines the patriotic arborealism of Northern Renaissance and Romantic artists such as Albert Altdorfer and Caspar David Friedrich. Likewise, as Baselitz made it clear to me in an interview, he found Kiefer paintings from the early to mid-1970s highly impressive, including Varus, a work that relates to many historical strata, and a painting with its bullet hole impressions that can be compared to Baselitz's anthropomorphic breathing tree. You can't see that here, but there are sort of blood-like bullet holes in the canvas itself. Baselitz's next major pictorial device would now become his signature method of inverting imagery, The Forest on Its Head being the first painting to employ this technique in 1969. The inverted tree trunk is suggestive of some disturbance of cultural memory in the iconic locale of German Romanticism, or worse, that the world, and particularly Germany, has been turned upside down by terrible historical forces. This reading is reinforced by other paintings that question German nationhood, such as finger painting Eagle of 1972. Interestingly, Richter also created an eagle in the same year as Baselitz, but one that was commissioned by Breuters, this very same Breuters who later objected to Kiefer's occupations. Richter's work was included in Breuters' work of institutional critique, Museum of Modern Art Department, Eagle Figure Section, comprising of 282 eagle-orientated objects, and it was held in the Düsseldorf Kunsthalle in 1972. Also in 1972, Richter painted 48 portraits for the German pavilion of the Venice Biennale. He created 48 individual portraits of historical figures for the exhibition space of the pavilion. Writers, scientists, composers, philosophers can be found, whereas politicians and artists are not represented. Franz Kafka, Thomas Mann, Albert Einstein, Oscar Wilde are among the most famous, alongside lesser-known individuals. The 48 portraits depict solely white Central European and American males, born between 1824 and 1904. Richter selected them from 270 portrait photographs that he had taken from encyclopedias and lexicons and collected for his Atlas project. The choice of a standardized format and source images similar in form underline the uniformity of the paintings. The realization in grayscale, as well as the soft rendering of the faces that show only a few wrinkles or unevenness, make the pictures appear as a homogeneous entity. The German pavilion of the Venice Biennale was reconstructed in 1938 and therefore reflects the architecture of National Socialist Germany. It's been said that the framework of this monumental architecture was suitable for this choice of the portrait genre associated with political leaders, except of course Richter does not present political leaders. Thereby, this was a process of disidentification with the German paternal, if you like. Kiefer has more shots of 48 portraits there. And I think Richter's 48 portraits definitely influenced Kiefer's ways of worldly wisdom from 1978, which was exhibited in the Venice Biennale in 1980. Except Kiefer does focus on political figures and military figures, and he appropriated images from a National Socialist publication by Karl Ganser entitled Face of the German Leader, 200 portraits of German fighters and pioneers across 2,000 years. And in Ways of Worldly Wisdom, Kiefer unifies their diverse countenances in response to Richter's use of grayscale by rendering them in the rough-cut style of expressionist printmaking. The overpainted black spirals that formally bind the heroic heads to the charred tree trunks, suggestive of the burnt-out Goethe oak, might refer to tree growth rings, spiders' webs, forest tracks, or equally the splintered lines could be perceived as barbed wire. Combined with the flaming pie at the centre, the image conveys both Wagnerian myth and Holocaust abomination. But Kiefer was not wedded to the notion of the original woodcut in the same way as the expressionist generation to which he responded. So for an artist like Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, each impression coming off the block had artistic validity and authenticity, whereas for Kiefer, he just saw the woodcuts as matter, to be kind of endlessly recycled and used, as these photographs of his studio show. He was kind of careless about how he reutilized woodcuts in a curious way. It was just one material for him. And Kiefer's work was exhibited with Baselitz's in the Venice Biennale in 1980. So some years after Richter was also shown at Venice. But this was a sensational show, a controversial show. Baselitz's model for sculpture, his first sculpture from 1979, was exhibited in the space with Kiefer's work surrounding it. And of course, there was great controversy as a result. They were both dubbed by the German critics as neo-fascists. And this wood culture of Baselitz certainly relates to an expressionist tradition too. So it's worth thinking about Baselitz in relation to Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, you see here. But also to African tribal carving that he was inspired by. The difference is that Baselitz used a chainsaw to create his over life-size sculptures. So they're kind of really violent, some of them, in terms of their execution. And of course, this wood culture that you see in the Baroque artists, woodcuts from 1907, 1908, is also, you can see Baselitz responding to the Baroque there too. This is a new type woodcut from 1966, and you see it's kind of almost like a kind of peeling wall effect that he's kind of taken from Haeckel, certainly responding to the Baroque there. And Baselitz was basically remixing expressionism. So his famous painting Supper in Dresden from 1983 was responding to three sources: Emil Nolte's Last Supper, Edvard Munch's The Scream, you can see the central figure here, and also Kirchner's Group of the Artists. And he kind of conflates all three. He had a sort of magpie approach, similar to the Baroque artists themselves. So you can say remixing expressionism. This expressionism, or neo-expressionism, was supported by the figures that you see here on the top row. So the critic Donald Cuspit, the curator Nicholas Sirota, Norman Rosenthal, Charles Saatchi, Anthony Doffey, Rudi Fuchs, and others besides. They all supported the careers of Baselitz and Kiefer and this phenomenon of neo-expressionism. On the bottom row, you see the detractors, including Benjamin Buchloh and Hal Foster of the October group. And Buchloh, in particular, in a sense, turned his back on Kiefer, perhaps because Kiefer's work led to the collapse of his magazine, I don't know. But more seriously, I think because of Kiefer's painterly practice was not something that Buchloh could support anymore by the late 1970s. And he became the great champion of Gerhard Richter. And so this whole debate on expressionism, neo-expressionism, was played out in publications such as Art in America, as well as October. And artists like Baselitz and Kiefer were seen as regressive, as culturally regressive there, whereas Richter was championed, as I say, by the likes of Buchloh. Donald Cuspit was a strong defender of Kiefer, and he said German painting, or rather new German painting, he refused to use the term neo-expressionism, does not wish to restate the old claims of organic unity, aura, and the presence of painting, but to let us know that heterogeneity, mechanical procedures, and seriality no longer carry out the subversive function of the modern aesthetic. And this was to do with what he thought was a dry conceptualism, a dry minimalism, that he was basically encouraging the joy of paint, if you like, in neo-expressionism, and he saw Baselitz, Immerdorf, Kiefer, Lupet, Penck as an interesting new way, in a sense. Cuspit continued with his criticism of Richter, in the early 2000s, and he compared a Richter show with a Kiefer show, and he said, "A final word, the Kiefer exhibition is a welcome relief after the recent exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. There are two kinds of German grey, the grey of the murky depths and the grey of the shallow surface. Kiefer is expert at plumbing the depths, risking the possibility of spiritual depth in a shallow world, while Richter is expert at skimming the surface. His art is insufferably shallow. Richter's art seems to have Americanized German art, for it has abandoned itself to the everyday shallowness that engulfs us all." And in a sense, Cuspit was echoing a criticism that Baselitz had already made in the 1960s there. I know Donald Cuspit, but I don't agree with his position on Richter at all. I think Richter, although he might well deal with the surface, is actually intellectually a very, very deep artist indeed. These are some more works, but I'm not going to dwell on these because I'm conscious of time, from the Artist Rooms collection. You probably can't see them anyway. They're grey paintings, 3 different grey paintings. But he also produced more colourful abstract works, seemingly gesturing to abstract expressionism in some respects, but also using a kind of mechanical procedure for their execution. So there's an interesting tension there. I'm coming to an end very shortly. Richter also was praised by Buchloh for addressing the contemporary world, whereas Kiefer, Buchloh said, was regressive, dwelling on the Nazi past and almost commodifying, Buchloh suggested, the Nazi past. Richter, by contrast, was not afraid of addressing contemporary issues. And this is September of 2005, produced obviously a few years after 9/11. Extraordinary work, which seems to sort of still the horror there. I mean, it's not entirely fair, Buchloh's comment, because Kiefer had actually for example, responded to the Baader-Meinhof situation already in a work from 1973. Again, you won't be able to see it, but he's put the names of the Baader-Meinhof terrorists in this Parsifal stage set image. Richter responded to the Baader-Meinhof situation also, but it's quite belated, 1988 here. Richter's work was shown in MoMA in 2002, a year after 9/11, and of course it created a bit of a sensation because any representation of terrorism at that point was extremely sensitive there. So just to finish off, if I was to say these are very diverse artists, but one unifying factor, I think, is the German forest, whether it's Beuys, Baselitz, Kiefer or Richter. The Wald, if you like, the arboreal, seems to be something that connects all of them. From Kiefer's early work in the 1970s, when he was living in a forest, to his most recent work, and finally here, Gerhard Richter's series, which is entitled Wald, from 2005, and was in an exhibition which was called From Caspar W. Friedrich to Gerhard Richter, which was shown at the Getty in 2006. And it seems to suggest that Richter was, in a sense, a contemporary romantic, perhaps defying Baselitz's earlier criticisms of him. That's it. Sorry. Yeah. Very sorry for the English, but hopefully it made sense.
So I think we're bringing in more chairs, because we've got more people standing at the back. We're going to go straight on to Aline in a minute when we get more chairs. Have we run out of chairs?
No, we've got plenty of chairs. We just underestimated the popularity. Thank you for coming.
Shall we come and sit down? Sure.
We're already going down. Do I actually put the chair down or arrange it?
So save up your thoughts. As I say, we'll be sending you a question. We're bringing more chairs. We're bringing more chairs. I wish the sun would go. Can you believe it? Okay, let's press on.
Okay. Can you hear me at the back?
Can everybody hear?
Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. Great. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about. Is that unpleasant?
You stand a little bit away from the that's good. Yeah.
Talking about Richter's early portraits in the wider context of the 1960s, and in particular in relation to pop art and what I call the pop portrait. Portraits run through Richter's work like a red thread. So Richter made portraits from mass media images, family portraits, portraits from anonymous strangers, and they span 6 decades of his career. And tonight I'll be focusing on the portraits from the 1960s, and in particular on Emma nude on a staircase, which is a portrait of his first wife from 1966. And as you can see, it's a full-length nude portrait. It's an oil painting on canvas based on a photograph, and that's typical of Richter's technique, the photo painting from photographs. But Emma differs from Richter's earlier photo paintings in 2 significant ways. Firstly, it's one of the first photo paintings to be made from a color photograph. And secondly, it's the first photo painting based on a photograph taken by Richter himself. So former photo paintings had been based on found photographs. For instance, the Uncle Rudy that we saw with Christian. The painting subtitle, Nude on a Staircase, immediately brings to mind Duchamp's painting from 1912, entitled Nude Descending a Staircase. And however, if you look at the 2 paintings, comparison suggests that Richter aims to position his version as a reversal of Duchamp's own painting, and especially a reversal of the deconstruction of the human figure. Richter himself.
I was looking at the text. Sorry about that.
Richter himself in one of his many interviews, says of Emma that he could never accept that Duchamp's nude had put paid once and for all to a certain kind of painting. So he did the opposite and painted a conventional nude. So this is Richter speaking. Now we need to tread carefully with Richter's statement on his artistic practice, because he's rather notorious for having said something and then said the contrary in another interview. And in this talk, I precisely wish to challenge this statement and ask the following question: just how conventional a nude is Emma? And, or to put it in other words, how does Emma relate to Richter's wider production of portraits at that time, so in the 1960s? And these portraits, as we will see, which are heavily influenced by Andy Warhol's portraits and thematize the deconstruction of both the human subject and the human body through mechanical reproduction. So Richter's first portraits from photographs date from the very beginning of his painting career in West Germany, and we've heard a little bit about this with Christian's talk. Richter was from Dresden and he moved to the West in '61, where the dominant mode of artistic expression was abstraction. And he also studied with teachers who promoted abstraction. So why did Richter start focusing on figurative painting at that time? In fact, when Richter moved to Düsseldorf, he showed his work to a West German artist called Peter Brünig, and he had a mix of abstract and figurative paintings, and he was taken aback when Brünig praised his figurative work but showed absolutely no interest in his abstract paintings. Richter said of the episode, "This astonished me because I thought that one had to paint abstract paintings here in the West." In this context, we can ascribe Richter's quasi-immediate decision after moving to Düsseldorf to start painting from photographs to three different factors. Firstly, his prior training in East Germany as a socialist realist painter, and this accounts in particular for his extremely skilled painter, figurative painter, that's what I meant. Secondly, the influence of fluxus, which was very important in Germany at the time, especially in Düsseldorf, and which updated data practices and foreground the use of photographs, so linked with the photo paintings. And finally, the influence of pop art, which used mass media and other images derived from popular culture to make paintings, and in particular figurative paintings. Although all three factors are important, I will focus on the last one, namely the influence of North American artists associated more or less closely with pop art. This influence on Richter's portraits from the 60s and 70s. The first one of these artists is Robert Rauschenberg, and although he was not strictly speaking a pop artist, he's important because he was arguably the first North American artist of the post-war period to start using photographs in the context of painting, so adding photographs and prints to his canvases from the late 1940s onwards. And what's particularly important for what interests us here, which is Richter, is that Richter had been granted authorization to travel to West Germany to visit the second documenter in Kassel. As we heard from Christian, he was very impressed with abstract expressionism, and he also would have seen one of Rauschenberg's work at that time, an abstract painting entitled Thor, which I don't know if you can see, but mixes abstract, gestural abstraction with images, and in particular a photograph of a landscape with two trees up there. So Rauschenberg, with this and other works of the same period, bridged the gap between photography and painting, and to some extent between figuration and abstraction, providing a context to Richter's photo paintings. Richter's most significant influence at the beginning of the 60s, however, remains Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, so pop artists, which he first discovered around 1962, 1963. And in fact, Richter and his artistic colleagues at the Düsseldorf Art Academy were so enthused by pop art that they appropriated the term, and when they went to Paris to introduce their work to gallery owners in Paris, introduced themselves as German pop artists. And we can see, as we're going to see now, Richter's photo paintings are in direct dialogues with Warhol's work from 1963 onwards, and in particular, Richter's portraits. The earliest example of this is Mouth, a painting from 1963, which is based on a detail of a photograph of the French actress Brigitte Bardot. You wouldn't be able to tell, right? Mouth is interesting for two reasons. Firstly, because it recuperates Warhol's interest in celebrity culture and in particular actresses, and transposes it into a European context. And secondly, because it's a portrait which doesn't adhere to the traditional code of portraiture. It's only a detail which at first sight could almost appear as an abstract motif. So with Mouth, we begin to see that Warhol's influence on Richter is not limited to subject matter, but that it's also deeply concerned with reinventing portraiture in the post-war period. And I won't dwell on this too much because Christian already talked about this, but this is another link between Richter and Warhol in the early 70s with the portrait of Brigitte Bardot. 8 Student Nurses of 1966 are 8 individual paintings which represent 8 victims of a Chicago serial killer. The presentation of the paintings following a grid format directly results from the layout of the newspaper article that it's taken from. And so the use of the mass media source is already a link with pop art, but what's interesting is that the grid format also evokes 2 characteristics of Warhol's portraits, numbering and seriality. Richter's choice of title, 8 Student Nurses, directly references the numbering format used by Warhol at the time in several of his portraits. And one key example is 13 Most Wanted Men, a work of 1964, which is composed of 13 mugshots of men and subsumes them under a single category, these Most Wanted Men. So we see with this example that Warhol inspired Richter's portrait production of the 1960s. However, it's also true that the comparison I've made here has its limits. Richter, as Emma, the portrait of his first wife, demonstrates, does not solely focus on mass media images, but also on the private, intimate material. And in fact, I think that's what Richter most interestingly draws from the portrait lies not so much in the subject matter of the paintings, but more fundamentally in a new conception of the human subject and its representation in the post-war period. So what do I mean by a new conception of the human subject? I'm going to take a few examples, first from pop art, and then I'll move on to Richter. And I'm going to focus now on Roy Lichtenstein's and Andy Warhol's portraits, and suggest that they work not only at deconstructing the human subject, but also at rethinking the human subject in the 1960s. So these are 2 works made by Roy Lichtenstein in 1961, Portrait of Alan Capro and Portrait of Ivan Karp, and 2 people who were close acquaintances of Lichtenstein. However, as you can see, this portrait makes absolutely no attempt to resemble either Capro or Karp. Most strikingly still, both portraits are almost identical. Rather than trying to capture the likeness of his friends, Lichtenstein has simply chosen an advertising image out of which is made a stencil, allowing him to reproduce the image any number of times. So the portraits that he makes present the human subject as the product of mass reproduction, lifted from mass culture, emptied of all individuality or subjectivity, and absolutely interchangeable. While Lichtenstein has only made 2 portraits here, the fact that they originate in a form of automated mechanical reproduction already paved the way for Warhol's serial portraits. And in fact, it might be relevant to add that Lichtenstein had originally intended to make 12 copies, but he got tired of it and just stopped after 2 portraits. So moving on to Warhol, I'm going to focus on the Marilyn diptych, which is, like all of Warhol's portraits of the actress, is based on the same publicity still of 1953. Which is then reproduced by Warhol on the canvas using the mechanical reproduction process called silk screening. However, the Marilyn diptych is unusual in its structure and makes it stand out from other serial portraits of Marilyn by Warhol. As you can see, it displays Marilyn's portrait 25 times on the left in color and 25 times on the right in black and white. And on the right-hand side, we've got these very harsh, flat colors which draw attention to the quasi-industrial making process of the image. And on the right-hand side, well, something seems to have gone wrong. So as you can see, black paint, presumably applied in excess during the silk spinning process, almost entirely obliterates the actress's face in the second column. And by contrast, if you look to the right of the right panel, the faces are barely visible on the canvas, figuring only as ghostly impressions. The irregular inking process produces a range of effects. We might think of photographic over and underexposure, or of a progressive decomposition of the image quality that happens when you photocopy an image, a black and white image, too many times. Crucially, the right side panel presents us with an unstable and fragile image in which the repeated faces appear at risk of being exhausted in the process of their own reproduction. Instead of presenting us with the endlessly repeated face we all know so well, the Marilyn diptych stages the collapse of the face and of the individual subject. And as such, what's interesting is that this serial portrait displays an image of Marilyn Monroe which is surprisingly close to reality. And by this I don't mean realism, but the reality of a subject who only exists as a screen for private and collective fantasies, and who, once these fantasies are peeled off, simply fades away. The ink runs out and Marilyn disappears. The examples of Lichtenstein and Warhol show that in the early 60s, pop artists drew the conclusions of, on the one hand, pop culture and mass consumerism, and on the other hand, mechanical reproduction, in order to explore what these new conditions meant for the changing nature of the human subject. So, moving back to Richter, at first sight, Emma appears to be a striking counterexample to these pop portraits. It's neither serial nor achieved via mechanical reproduction in the way that Warhol's canvases of Marilyn Monroe's face were. Rather, Richter uses a very traditional technique, art on canvas, and paints by hand. Yet, there are two important ways in which Emma connects with the pop portrait. The first one lies in Richter's painting technique. The photo paintings are often famously blurred, and you will have seen an example of this with Uncle Rudy earlier. Some of these photo paintings are very blurred, so almost to the point where you can't see very well what's being painted. And this blurring effect evokes photography, but is actually achieved by applying a wet brush to still wet oil paint, so it's a very manual process. This blurring effect is more or less pronounced, but in Emma it's very subtle and hardly noticeable at all. And at a distance it gives a quasi-photorealistic quality to the woman's body, a sort of shimmering effect you can get with a photograph sometimes. Upon closer scrutiny of the canvas, however, the blurring becomes more visible, and one increasingly perceives that the photorealistic effect is attained through some form of fuzziness, or we could say a slight deconstruction of the figure, this blurring of the figure. And in this, Richter's portrait produces an effect comparable to Warhol's Marilyn diptych, namely that of the progressive dissolution of the portrait figure, which happens through the means of its reproduction. So with Warhol, it's the silk screening process. With Richter, it's the blurring. Crucially, Richter himself has drawn a comparison between his early blur and Warhol's mechanical technique, saying that, I quote, "Warhol showed me this modern way of letting details disappear. He did it with silk screening and photography, and I did it through mechanical wiping." The second way in which Emma connects with the pop portrait lies in Richter's interest at that time, so around the mid-1960s, in the deconstruction of portraiture by way of experimental photography. In 1966, the very year that he painted Emma, Richter produced several photographic self-portraits which deconstruct the representational expectation of the genre of portraiture. So that's the first example. You can see the artist's face is distorted. I don't know if you can see, actually, he's applied some tape to his face here and on the eyelid and on the eyebrow to sort of push it in a different direction. And the second example is this one, also 1966, where the artist has applied a balloon over his head, or perhaps it's a scarf, I'm not sure, completely masking his face. It's also in 1966 that Richter told an interviewer that it is far better to paint a portrait from a photograph because no one can ever paint a specific person, only an image that has nothing whatever in common with the sitter. So again, you see this putting the subject at a distance, very against the tradition of portraiture. So why is this relevant to Emma? Well, because the compositional history of Emma, this apparently conventional nude, precisely engages with the tradition of experimental photography that favors seriality, deconstruction, and abstraction over the faithful representation of the human subject. This is a photograph taken from Atlas. And Atlas is Richter's ongoing collection of photographs and sketches and collage that has also become an artwork in its own right. Despite the overall grainy texture of the image, we immediately recognize, or perhaps not immediately, but after a while we recognize that the figure that's portrayed here is Richter's first wife, as it appears in the painting Emma. The face, the line of the shoulder. It also looks like it is positioned on a staircase, and you can see also the line of the arm is all exactly similar to the painting. The major difference is that in the photograph, Richter's first wife has been captured 8 times, and that with each new exposure, the figure is losing in sharpness and resemblance. And how does this photograph relate to the painting? We don't know for sure, but it's so the question is it a photograph of his wife before he made the painting as a sort of study for the painting, or is it a photograph of the painting after it was painted? According to Richter's longtime assistant and biographer, and I think this is probably the most reliable source we have on this, Dietmar Elger, Richter claims that the photograph was a study for Emma rather than a later photograph of the painting, and several other facts to do with the way the photograph is dated and when the painting was sold confirm this view. Emma, the neoclassical painting, therefore, is shown paradoxically to come out of experimental photography. The Atlas photograph, in particular, evokes a specific kind of early experimental photography called chronophotography, a technique which was first developed by the French scientist Étienne Jules Maret in the late 19th century. Maret developed this technique of chronophotography in order to capture and represent humans and animals in motion. It was quite a mystery at the time, exactly what happens in motion. There was not a technique that allowed us to capture that before Maret. And so this is one example of chronophotography, the flight of a bird. Maret used a kind of photographic gun which could shoot its subject at very short exposures and allowed him to capture the different stages of motion on the same negative. And we can see that the final result has some similarities with the photograph that is Richter put in Atlas. So the link to chronophotography is not only a formal one, it's important for 2 reasons. First, for a discussion of the painting in terms of the blurring that we observed earlier, this painterly dissolution. Although it may appear like a photorealistic work of art, Emma is also, at the same time, a work that challenges realism and gestures towards more complex notions of representation, like the decomposed motion of Maret's photographs. With trying to represent reality as accurately as possible, you end up with a photograph which doesn't look realistic at all. That's what I'm trying to say. Secondly, in seeing Emma through the prism of chronophotography, we now see its relation to Duchamp's nude descending a staircase under a completely different light. And this is not only because Duchamp's nude was, as Duchamp himself recognized, inspired by Maret's chronos photograph of the human body. It's also because if we look at the Atlas photograph, we see that the female figure, decomposed into 8 takes and organized from the top left to the bottom right of the image, gives the impression that it has been animated and is actually in the process of descending the staircase in a manner strikingly similar to Duchamp's painting. You can see the similar movement. And you will remember that Richter had claimed that he intended with Emma to do the opposite of what Duchamp had done with his nude descending the staircase, and position his nude on the staircase, not descending the staircase. And yet with this comparison, we see that Richter's relationship to Duchamp is more complex than he had given us to understand. Emma, of course, is no complete return to Duchamp. If it were, it probably look rather different. And neither is it entirely consistent with pop art, despite the formal and technical links I highlighted. To conclude on the comparison I attempted here between Emma and the pop portrait, we can say that unlike pop art, which sought to banish realistic representation of the human subject, Richter with Emma achieves an effect close to neoclassical realism, while at the same time demonstrating, both in the painterly quality as we saw and in its compositional history, that such realism is deeply indebted to mechanical reproduction. So Emma then is at the same time an intimate portrait of his first wife, and also a reflection on the condition of painting after photography.
Thank you. So, they've hit us with an awful lot, give us a lot to think about, but are you going to give us homework or not? Have you got a question for us?
I think I have.
Well then,
So,
just these, I have to switch it on there. You'll just shout.
okay, I'll shout. Okay, I was very interested in listening to Lee's paper, talking about mechanical procedures. I was thinking whether Richter ever used wood or organic material. I don't think so. I mean, that's tied to a particular national identity with Bartlitz and Kiefer. So the question is, there is a question somewhere. Thinking about Bartlitz's criticism of Richter selling out to an American idea of art, do you think that's fair? Do you think that art should in some way be connected to national identity or help construct a cultural national identity, or should we all be internationalist in our vision? Thinking about
That was about 4 questions, wasn't it?
Yeah. Okay. Was Bartlitz fair in criticising Richter?
Good. And you, what's your homework?
Okay, I've got 2 mics now.
Oh, that's fine.
So the question I had was, I don't know if I should ask this question.
Well, ask it anyway.
Okay, so the painting that I was talking about, Emma, is 1966, and a lot of the paintings that Christian talked about, such as Uncle Rudy, are of the same time period, 1965, 1964, etc. And my question is, how do you think we can reconcile these 2 different approaches of Richter? One which is more historical, painting photographs that evoke the World War II, and then something a lot more influenced by pop art, a lot more deconstructivist. So how can we at all reconcile these 2 aspects of Richter?
Well, they're really easy questions. Thanks for that. Okay, at that point, you get to a glass of wine and we'll talk. And we'll come back together again in 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so. There's a toilet just round the
Can you grab me what? 0? Oh, wow.